Here is the next installment for The Hostage, and we're up to Chapter 15. Roscoe could still remember the very first time he tasted a home-baked cake, made with Jessie's secret ingredients of love and kindness in the tiny kitchen of her small apartment in the Brixton area of London. It was his 3rd birthday, and from that day forward he'd known nobody could bake cakes the way his Aunt Jessie could. Jessie had lived in the apartment upstairs from the Roscoe family, and it hadn't taken her long to realise John's dad was a bad lot. She'd been able to hear the shouting each evening when Colin Roscoe returned home, and Jessie had increasingly feared for John and his mother. While never one to shy away from confrontation, she'd known the best thing she could do to help was not enrage Colin Roscoe any further. Jessie had started to call in each morning and afternoon to make sure Helen Roscoe was coping, and she had everything she needed for her young son. She'd known not to insult Helen by offering her money, but she'd had a special skill at finding whatever it was Helen or John needed at any point in time, usually hidden away in her old wardrobe or tucked away at the back of her kitchen cupboard. She loved how John had begun to think of her wardrobe as a magical place, and had known Helen never ceased to be grateful for the toys or clothes or bikes which Jessie had found, having kept them since her own teenage son Alvin was a small boy. The one time Jessie had offered Helen money was the day Colin Roscoe had left for good. She'd known he was gone forever, and although she'd been relieved for Helen, she had known that while he had been a bad lot, Colin had at least provided a roof over his family's heads. Now Helen was alone in the world, her son, and her unborn child. Jessie hadn't had a huge amount herself, but when Alvin's father had died 2 years before, he had left her and their son enough to live on. She'd gone to Helen with her first month's rent, and had received a promise it would be repaid as soon as Helen had received her first paycheck from the 2 jobs she had taken on. Jessie had insisted there was no need, but the day after Helen had been paid, the loan amount had been quietly slipped under Jessie's front door. Jessie had known to accept the money graciously, but in the weeks that followed, some extra discoveries would be made at the back of her magic wardrobe. Jessie and Helen had become the closest of friends, and to John, Aunt Jessie had become a second mother. On the nights his mum would be working, John would go upstairs for his supper, and then Jessie would love putting him down to sleep in her own bed. When Helen would come home from work, she'd wrap John in a blanket and carefully carry him down the stairs before handing him over to his mother's waiting arms. Every night when Helen took hold of her son, Jessie's heart would break as she saw how close to exhaustion her dear friend had become. Jessie often thought of the day John's baby sister Amanda arrived in the world, arriving in great haste on a cold and wet December evening. Helen had stopped working the week before, and with John safely asleep in bed, she sat watching television with Jessie. As Jessie had cleared away the dinner plates and Alvin had finished his homework, Helen had rested her feet in front of the latest soap opera. Very quickly all of the action had been in Jessie's apartment, and with the baby on her way, Jessie had called a cab to take her and Helen to the hospital while Alvin was given clear instructions on what he needed to do to care for John. But Alvin had known that that part would be easy. John had idolized Alvin, loving him like a big brother, and would always behave whenever he asked him to. Jessie had helped Helen into the cab, but as they'd made their way through the London streets, they'd got caught up in the traffic created by eager Christmas shoppers. Jessie had praised the Lord as a cab driver had performed miracles to get them to the hospital in double quick time, but the real miracle had been in the back of the cab, where she'd delivered Helen's baby daughter. When the cab had arrived at the hospital, the cord had been cut, and Helen's new baby had been carried into the building. Helen and Jessie had followed along with 2 nurses, and it hadn't been long before Helen was sitting up in bed, nursing baby Amanda Jessica. Jessie had smiled a broader smile, and felt for the first time that her family was complete. Jessie had known life for Helen was never going to be easy with 2 young children and 2 jobs, but she'd been happy doing everything she could to help. Often in the evening she would see Helen arrive home exhausted as she made her way downstairs to carefully hand over both of the children. Over time she'd seen the sparkle disappear from Helen. Her smiles were gone, and the laughter in her eyes, which had appeared after Colin had left, had gradually faded away. On a warm summer evening, Jessie had sat with Helen in their small shared garden and had told her friend she looked shattered. Tears had welled in Jessie's eyes as Helen broke down and admitted she was finding life harder and harder. Jessie had suggested they take the children away for the weekend, and 2 weeks later they'd been walking in sun-drenched open fields. Jessie had known it had been the right thing to do, as John had run across the fields with Alvin, while Amanda had toddled along, holding hands with Helen and Jessie. After 2 wonderful days, they'd caught the bus back to London and home. As the bus had pulled into Victoria Station, Jessie had seen that Helen had fallen asleep, and she'd reached across to wake her. But she hadn't been able to stir her dearest friend, and suddenly Jessie had been standing with the 3 children, watching Helen being loaded into the back of an ambulance. 24 hours later, Helen's diagnosis had been made. The cancer had spread to her bones, and suddenly she had to decide about the future of her children. Tears had filled her eyes as Helen had asked Jessie to take care of John and Amanda after she was gone. Jessie hadn't hesitated for a moment, and when the time had come, John and Amanda had made their way up the stairs and Jessie's home had become theirs. Jessie still remembered the first night when John had been into her home, how he and Alvin had carried his toys up the stairs, and how, as he'd walked into the apartment, he had smelt the most delicious cake she had spent the afternoon baking. On his saddest day, as he'd sat at her kitchen table and eaten his way through 3 chocolate muffins, she had been able to see that he was beginning to feel warm inside. Amanda had been sitting next to him, and Jessie had been able to see how protective John felt of his little sister. 2 years later, Jessie had adopted John and Amanda, and Aunt Jessie became the only real mother Amanda could remember. John had still thought of his own mother, but Jessie had known that he loved her as much as any child could love a mother. Throughout John's childhood, Jessie would spend every Saturday baking fresh cakes and brownies for her family and creating her own most wonderful recipes. When the coffee shop folk had moved into Brixton, suddenly cakes and baking had become cool. Jessie had listened to John's encouragement, and now she had her own successful business. And with John working at the New London Tribeca Hotel, it seemed only right that Auntie's Bakery would be the supplier of the best home-cooked muffins and donuts anywhere in London. And that ends that instalment for The Hostage.